Hi guys, how's it going out there? Um, I've been trying to get this done while watching the Brown University MIT situation. It's very crazy times right now, and so we're going to do this presentation and try to stay focused with so much happening in the news as we speak. Well, I decided for my presentation and my project to focus on a pressing issue that I've always wanted to pursue in my life because I was considering a career in aviation. And over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of study about the health risks of being a pilot. What are the health risks? I was reading that pilots have a cancer risk when it comes to melanoma. And it sort of made sense to me, but there were a lot of holes in the research that I didn't really understand. So it sort of made sense to me because I was looking at, pilots are in front of a windshield all day. They must be above the troposphere, and they get hit by the sun's rays at a much stronger amount, and they're going to get cancer from that. I wanted to see what was out there, but I also knew that car windshields, if you're driving a car, you're using laminated glass. And I was reading that airplane windshields used on commercial aircraft especially have all sorts of UV coatings in the glass, just like cars. And I know, because I used to have a career in collision repair, that car windshields block UV rays, UVB rays especially, because it's laminated glass. There's special UV protective coating on the glass. And aircraft, turns out, has the same setup. But I wanted to see, if that's the case, why are pilots still getting cancer and drivers are not? Just because they're higher in the sky? And then also, if melanoma is so high and yet cosmic radiation doesn't cause melanoma, so what's really happening here? Well, the number one thing, and I talk about this in the abstract, 8 miles high, aviation and military cancer cluster. And it's looking at the high incidence of aviation professionals in comparison to the high incidence of military service members in regards to three main cancers, and that's melanoma, prostate, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So I decided to look at two studies, two significant studies, really three. Sanlorenzo studies that was conducted in 2015, and that was a part of two studies. And what it did was it showed that pilots have twice the rate of melanoma compared to the rest of the population. They also put UV meters on the pilot's chest and had them fly 2 flights. And they found some contradictory information which didn't make any sense to me. They found, and this is a chart right here, that aircraft windshields allowed 0 UVB radiation to pass through them. And then I had to find a better study than just 2 flights. I found a study that was conducted in 2020 called the Basinska study out of the UK, and they tracked over 300 flights from commercial pilots. And they found that in 70% of the 70% of flights, really, UVA radiation did not exceed safe levels, did not exceed beyond what would be considered unsafe or safe. So then I'm looking at this, okay, what is my hypothesis? My hypothesis then would be to showcase that these cancers among pilots are not due to an occupational risk, but rather are due to environmental pollutants and something that the pilots are being exposed to that has nothing to do with exposure to the sun while working on a plane. The null hypothesis would be that commercial pilots have an increased rate of melanoma, like it says in the study, due to sunlight exposure on aircraft, not due to environmental factors. And so I had to look at 4 different studies. I had to try to figure out, well, what is a common denominator between pilots and something that may be putting them at risk of exposure to something? Well, if you look throughout the history of the United States, For most of our history, we had a military draft. And before the year 2000, really pre 9/11 era, the 90th percentile, and that's the overwhelming majority of pilots, were Vietnam veterans, Desert Storm veterans. And so they had military experience. Then I thought, well, that's interesting. That's not the case anymore, but the study that linked melanoma tracked pilots from 1970 to 2004. So that includes pilots that served in Vietnam, for example, maybe even World War II veterans. And so I had to look at this from a perspective of what does the military have in common to JetBlue or Delta? What does it have in common? And that was that pilots, it used to be overwhelmingly common for pilots to have served in the Air Force. And that's not the case anymore, but that's how you do a 30-year study. You can only take the past information. We don't have cancer data from 30 years into the future yet. So we have to take pilot statistics from the 70s and 80s, which would overwhelmingly skew the results. For that, we looked at these 4 studies right here. That would be, and I'll talk about study number 3 first on my list. But that was the top cancers diagnosed in young veterans who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. And this came out in 2022, actually. It's relatively recent. And this is a quote I'd like to include right here. The conclusion is that Iraq war veterans had double the incidence of melanoma compared with the general population, most likely due to sun exposure from being out in the desert for extended periods of time. So right off the bat, we can see in the results here that you have 6%, and then for veterans in general, it's 13%. So it's over double, almost double the amount actually, just in Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. But the more interesting study was the second study. That was right here. Cancer incidence and mortality among fighter pilot aviators in the United States Air Force. And this was conducted by the United States Air Force themselves. And it was called the Weber study. It also took place in 2022. And they found, and they followed up with this, they said Air Force pilot officers that served from 1970 to 2004, which included 411,000 Air Force pilot officers. They tested them for 10 different cancers, and they found that male fighter pilots were 25% more likely to develop melanoma over the general population, 19% more likely to develop prostate cancer, and 13% more likely to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Now, the big thing I see from this is the 25% more likely to develop melanoma. If flying was such a risk, once you isolated pilots from non-pilots or military in general, you find that fighter pilots actually have half the risk of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who served on the ground, which is really a remarkable statistic. Fighter pilots have half the risk of developing melanoma compared to veterans in general. If flying was such a cancerous risk, wouldn't that be reverse? Interesting, very interesting. We then realized that, well, we should take a look at Agent Orange and see for proof of Air Force service members being exposed to Agent Orange. Post 9/11, the military really changed actually in how they see Agent Orange and admit their wrongdoing. But that was the first time, remarkable, the first time that the VA changed their stance. Prior to 2002, they did not consider Agent Orange a qualifier for coverage for cancer. And now they do. They admit that Agent Orange leads to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. That's one of the main cancers linked to Agent Orange. And prior to 1994, they couldn't test for the dioxin TCDD. And this changed. What the study looked at was 3 C123s that sprayed Agent Orange. They found positive results. They concluded that we could no longer say that service members were not exposed to Agent Orange. And these were 2,100 Air Force Reserve veterans that served from 1972 to 1982. And the big thing from this study was that they did not know or could not find out how many C-123s were based in Vietnam, how many were used to spray Agent Orange. This is just one example. So it's fair to say that almost everyone that had served in Air Force Reserve on these planes would have been exposed to Agent Orange if they were conducting the same activities as this Air Force Reserve sample. So now we have a non-Hodgkin lymphoma link, we have a melanoma link, and we have a prostate link. These are pilots that were overwhelmingly exposed to Agent Orange, burn pits, and sun exposure. And this was reported in the American Academy of Dermatology and also in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology. 30% of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans had access to sunscreen, 70% did not. And less than 13% of respondents had any regular sunscreen routine at all. 70% of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans spent an average of 4 hours a day in direct sunlight, and 64% spent 3/4 of the day in direct sunlight. Fighter pilots, on the other hand, would have been better protected being behind a windshield that shielded from UVB rays. So that leads to my conclusion. And the conclusion of this and what I found were three things. Basically, that the hypothesis turned out to be correct. Based on these 4 studies, it would show there is a positive link with associating the most common cancers among commercial pilots with the most common cancers among service members in the military, that aircraft windshields do not allow melanoma-inducing UVB rays to enter through the laminated glass. 72% of flights measured in the Basinska study did not exceed safe UVA doses. And then the third major point of the results was that most of the pilots surveyed in these studies served from at least 1970 to 2004. They make up the group of Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan veterans. This would result in a heavy bias towards pilots which had served previous military careers. The point of approaching this study, or this literature review, if you want to call it, was not trying to prove that flying does or does not cause cancer. It was trying to prove, and this is the main word, pseudo-replication. That means there are too many random effects to conclude there to be twice the incidence of cancer caused by flying with no real control in the experiment. There are way too many confounding variables, and in my view, it is simply irresponsible to take one study and say flying doubles your rate of cancer because we looked at pilots and they have double the rate of cancer without considering their previous exposure to chemicals, to sun exposure, Agent Orange, all of these factors that we didn't recognize in the past, but now we do. And it's important because all of these studies survey pilots from a time period where the 90th percentile of pilots were exposed to these pollutants and cancer-inducing chemicals and sun exposure that had nothing to do with their career as a commercial pilot. There is strong evidence for all of this. And so I came to the conclusion that if you wanted an accurate study, you would have to separate, and this is the only way to do it, you separate military serving pilots from non-military serving pilots. You would have to take the 10% of pilots who never served in the military in the 60s and 70s. And you couldn't do that really, it'd be difficult. So going forward over the next 30 years, now that the overwhelming majority of commercial pilots are non-military, it would be wise to track them over the next 30 years and see if the cancer data changes. And if it does not, then we could conclude that that main point, that the conclusion of the main research article from Sanlorenzo, saying that flying increases your risk of cancer. But until we do that, in my view, it is irresponsible to make such a conclusion. And that's how I wanted to approach this entire subject. That you can't just look at occupational risk. You have to consider environmental exposure from your past and in the future. Once you look at the bigger picture, you can really see, what could be the cause of this, especially when there are careers that involve way more sun exposure than pilots get, and yet they don't have the same cancer. Landscapers are out in the sun for longer periods than pilots. And yet they don't have the same rate, double the rate of melanoma. So it didn't make any sense to me. And I'm really glad I did this study because it opened my eyes to why you should not have an alarmist attitude, and you should look at the data carefully. And I'm not saying that flying doesn't cause cancer. We may find out it does. But right now, there's simply far too little data to conclude that. And we do know that aircraft windshields do a great job at blocking UV rays. So I would not say that aircraft windshields cause double the rate of 3 different cancers. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And that's basically the research report. And guys, we reached our senior seminar. After 4 years, if you're about to graduate, I wish you success. I wish you a wonderful career in whatever you decide to pursue. And thank you for listening to this podcast, seminar, whatever you want to call it. Thanks for tuning in.